Go ahead. You're ready to go.
Great, thanks. Hi, good morning. This is Leigh Howard from Diana T. Myers and Associates. Thanks for joining the 2020 PIT webinar. I am joined here today in our office by Jessica Sones. Many of you had the opportunity to either meet her at the East or West COC meetings back in October, or engage with her during the last NOFA round. If you haven't met her, you're going to hear her voice in just a moment. And I'm officially passing the baton to Jessica on the PIT count. Many of you know that I've been the person to sort of lead the PIT count over the last 13 years or so from DMA. But we hired Jessica back in April, and she is our data person and terrific. And so I'm passing the baton, but participating in today's webinar, just hoping to answer any questions that come up. So please feel free to type in questions throughout the webinar, and we will answer as many as we can during the webinar today and follow up with anybody if needed after the fact. So with that, good morning, and here's Jessica.
Great. So we're excited to have so many folks on the webinar today. So what you can expect is we're going to cover the basics of the PIT count, which will be really helpful, especially for anyone who's new to the PIT count. And also we're going to go a little bit more in depth for folks who may coordinate the PIT count at the county level. We'll also cover information that's relevant if you're an emergency shelter, transitional housing provider, or if you're another homeless housing provider. Also, if you're a community partner, we'll talk about how you might be able to get involved in the PIT count. Following our overview, Brendan from DCED is going to go into an overview about the PIT mobile app. Some of you who were involved last year will remember last year was the first year that we offered the option for a mobile app to collect data for the PIT count. Some communities opted to use it and had a good experience. So we're going to continue that this year. So Brendan will talk about that. And then we're happy to have Chris Kapp from Cumberland County Housing and Redevelopment Authority, who's going to share some best practices and tips for the Unsheltered Count. Chris has led the Unsheltered Count in previous years in Cumberland County and is going to share some tips on things like engaging community partners, mapping out zones, things like that. So we're excited to have both Brendan and Chris sharing their expertise as well. All right, so we're going to dive in. So what is the PIT count? For those who are not familiar, it's a census, it's a count on a single night. It's a given point in time of how many folks are experiencing homelessness in your community. And we have to collect certain demographic information and characteristics about those folks. And HUD sets out pretty clear guidelines about the information that you're required to collect. Each year they may update it. This year they didn't really update it, so we have the same guidelines. HUD requires COCs to conduct PIT counts, and they require that it be in the end of January. So the PIT count includes 3 parts. You're going to hear this terminology throughout the webinar, so we want to make sure you're familiar with these 3 distinct parts. The housing inventory chart, the sheltered PIT count, and the unsheltered PIT count. And we're going to go into detail about what each of these are, but want to make sure you're familiar with that. There are 3 parts of the PIT count. So we know that the PIT count is just a snapshot. It's not all possible information about homelessness in the community, but when it's done with a consistent methodology at the same time every year, with the same reliable methodology, with high quality data standards, it does give us some important information to compare what homelessness looks like year over year. Most of our time today, we're going to be talking about the unsheltered PIT count, but we're also going to talk about the housing inventory chart and the sheltered PIT count so that folks know what those are and what's expected of folks. HUD does give pretty clear guidance. They put out a methodology guide and they set out pretty clear standards of what they want communities to do during the PIT count. So we'll talk through as we go what some of the standards are. So who is counted in the PIT count? We talked about the sheltered and the unsheltered PIT count. The sheltered PIT count includes emergency shelters. That also includes hotel and motel vouchers, transitional housing, and safe havens. We don't have any safe havens currently in the eastern or western PACOCs. Unsheltered pit count is any folks who are living in what's called a place not meant for human habitation. That could include folks who are staying outside, folks who are in their cars, in a park, abandoned building, anyone who's in a place that's not meant for human habitation. We'll go into more detail on this. So it's conducted in the last 10 calendar days of January. So in both the Eastern and Western PACOCs this year, it's on Wednesday, January 22nd. So we'll get into detail about what this means, but it's a period of time from Wednesday night to Thursday morning. So we want to know, where did folks sleep on that Wednesday night, January 22nd? Some folks conduct their counts during the daytime hours on that Thursday, which is fine, but it's asking folks where they stayed that Wednesday night.
I just want to piggyback off that to say, if your county does only conduct a daytime count, or if you include a daytime count at all in your approach, that daytime count has to occur on Thursday. That is a requirement, as opposed to Wednesday afternoon asking folks where they will be sleeping tonight.
Oh, that's a good point. All right, pit timeline. Some of you have already started planning for the pit count. I've heard actually from a lot of you that you're already gearing up for the pit count. Where we are right now is we're doing the pit webinar, getting folks geared up. We've actually already been sending out some of the materials for the pit count, trying to get ahead of the game a little bit this year. So if you are an unsheltered county coordinator, you've already received some materials from us this week. So we sent out the interview forms to you all this week. Right now, we're in the process of confirming all the programs that are in each community. So every type of emergency shelter, transitional housing, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, other permanent housing program, and who the contact person is, which is a pretty lofty task because some programs close or are new or contact persons change. So we've started that process. In January, we do a data quality check in HMIS for programs, emergency shelter, transitional housing programs, to see whether we can use their data for the point in time count. We'll get into that a little bit later. January 22nd is the pit count date. In February, all that data is due back to DMA for the unsheltered pit count. February and March, we check all the data, we clean up all the data, we do a lot of follow-up with you all to make sure everything is ready to go. And this year, our goal is to submit everything in March. Normally, the HUD deadline is the end of April. That gets a little tricky because sometimes if we're following up with data in April, you're like, but this happened in January, I can't remember. That was so long ago. I have no idea what happened back in January. That's like, it's like a lifetime ago. So we're trying to speed up the process so that if there are questions about the data, it's a little bit more fresh in people's minds.
So I just want to piggyback on that for again here. Couple things. One is that if you're on the call and you are an unsheltered county coordinator and you haven't received emails from us, you should type something in the chat box or send an email to our office. The email address to email is at the end of the PowerPoint. If you are a program operator and your program, a program within your organization, either opened or closed, and you haven't heard from us yet, please also inform us through that email. The other thing I'll just quickly say about the March 30th submission deadline, that's our goal, but there's no way that we can meet that goal without your help. I know, folks, there was some confusion last year around what date were what forms due, and that will certainly be crystal clear this year around deadlines. And so to the degree that we can have your help, we can certainly meet that March 30th deadline. Part of the reason we're trying to move that up is we start to get requests around that time. It's certainly within April for folks who need data for their consolidated plan. and who are working on ESG applications, etc. In addition, if you are receiving COC funding or interested in receiving COC funding, you'll start to see some emails coming out from our office in the next few weeks talking about moving up the NOFA process, hopefully providing the gaps analysis for the system at an earlier time of the year so that folks can do some analysis about what, or better understand what the needs identified are in your county, and hopefully look to propose projects to be responsive of that. So all of that being said, the March 30th deadline is really going to be contingent upon the timeliness of data submission and the responsiveness to questions once they're submitted. So we'll appreciate that.
All righty. So then in May, we dig down into the data and do PIT reports by the county and by the RAB so that if folks need that for county level planning, they have access to that. If you don't know what county level planning entails and you're an unsheltered coordinator, maybe you're new to this, as we go through this webinar, we will get into more detail about that, and we hope this will shed some light onto that. All right. For folks who are asking if the PowerPoint will be posted on Workplace and all of that, it will be following this webinar and all of that good stuff. All right, sheltered PIT count, the housing inventory chart, and the point in time count. Those are the two components of the sheltered PIT count. So the housing inventory chart, we're trying to make it very clear what these two terms mean. The housing inventory chart is also called the HIC. This is asking about beds and units. If you operate a program, how many beds are in your program and how many units? Even if they're not filled, how many are available for folks at a given time? And for the PIT count, this is how many people are in a program on the single point in time of the PIT count. So how many folks are in the program on the night of January 22nd? We're going to get into who has to submit info for which of these and all that good stuff. But to help people remember, the HIC is beds on units, the PIT is people. The housing inventory chart, this looks overwhelming, but I want to make people a little bit aware of what the housing inventory chart entails. We submit a lot of information to HUD about every single program in the COC that serves folks experiencing homelessness. So we have to collect that information from you all. Who does your program serve? What type of units and beds? How many units and beds do you have? Is your program for families? Is it for individuals? Is it for vets? Is it for youth? Is it DV specific? Maybe you have a seasonal program that's only open during the winter months. That's all the information that we have to collect from every single homeless dedicated program in the COC to submit the housing inventory chart count to HUD. So when we ask you all for that information, that's why, because we have to submit this very beautiful chart to HUD with all of this information.
And I will just also add that for those of you who have completed the online survey, which collects the data for the housing inventory chart, you'll know there's many, many more questions. That's just a portion of it's just a snapshot of some of the categories of data that are submitted to HUD. The actual spreadsheet has about 30 columns. So just to be clear, we're not asking additional information from you just for our own edification, but also it's required to HUD.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the programs that are included in the HIC are every type of program that serves folks experiencing homelessness. So it's emergency shelters, including DV shelters and hotel motel vouchers that are for folks experiencing homelessness, transitional housing, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, and other permanent housing, which is dedicated to folks experiencing homelessness. So if you operate one of these types of programs, we will be that's dedicated to folks experiencing homelessness. We will be reaching out to you to get this information from you. You've probably already heard from us, like Lee said. If you haven't and you operate a program, let us know. We'll make sure we're looping you in. Someone from your program has probably heard from us, but if not, let us know. So that's the folks that we reach out to for the housing inventory information. So the types of projects that are included in the HIC is projects that are dedicated to households experiencing homelessness. Or if you're a permanent housing projects, it's for folks who were homeless when they came into the program. So sometimes there's confusion about which projects in your community should be included on the HIC. So for the purposes of the HIC, the projects that are included is any project whose primary goal is to serve persons experiencing homelessness, projects that verify homeless status as part of eligibility, and the project clients are predominantly homeless when they come into the program. If you have an institutional setting, for example, that's not dedicated for persons who are homeless, that would include detox facilities, emergency rooms, jails, crisis treatment centers. Those are not included in the HIC. A few caveats to that is that extreme weather shelters are included in the HIC. And if you're not sure, sometimes there are projects where some of the beds are included in the HIC and some aren't. There might be a project where, because it's a small community, there's a program where maybe 2 of the units are always set aside for folks experiencing homelessness. We would count those 2 units on the HIC, but not the other ones that are for maybe just folks who maybe have mental health needs or something like that. So if you're not sure, reach out to us and we can help talk through it.
I also just want to add some clarity around Part C of the information presented there on the slide. What that means, and the part I want to clarify is the word predominantly. When you read the HUD guidance, what this talks about is that if a project, let's say a shelter were to be a low barrier shelter and someone presents overnight who's intoxicated and that shelter houses that individual, in the event that you find out the next day that that person is not actually homeless, that's okay because you were working off the information that you had available at that time. So when they say predominantly homeless, that's really what they're talking about. It doesn't mean that, well, most of the people are homeless in our program, but not everybody. That's not what they're referring to. They're really talking about those rare exceptions when, like I said, you may have somebody come in either overnight or at a time where you don't have staff in place to verify their homelessness, and they're there a day or a couple of days before that's realized. There you go.
Sorry, everyone, it's reloading. There we go. All right. All right, hopefully folks can see that. It just jumped out on us a little bit. Individuals in an opioid use disorder program be entered in the HIC. It's kind of situational. It depends if it's a program that's specifically for folks who are were experiencing homelessness.
So I know that there are a handful of communities in both the East and the West that have received the DHS housing opioid money. I don't know if that's what's being referred to, and we could certainly clarify that. I see this question is coming from Sabrina, who is in Greene County, and I know that you guys do have that DHS opioid housing money. The answer would be a little nuanced, but I'm happy to discuss it, or Jessica can certainly follow up if that's needed after this response. But the answer to you and to anybody else who is on the line and has the housing money from DHS is, do you have any of those beds or slots that are dedicated specifically for people experiencing homelessness? If you do, the answer would be yes. And we'd certainly have to talk a little bit more about the project to figure out how to classify the project. My assumption, without knowing better, would be that it would probably be classified under rapid rehousing, but we need to get some more information. If the project is housing anyone in the community and is not setting aside beds or slots for people experiencing homelessness, we most likely would not be counting that project. And part of the reason is, can you go back to like one slide or two slides where it said ABC? So this is related to Part A. The primary intent of the project is to serve persons experiencing homelessness. Most likely, your project, that is not the primary intent. The primary intent is to serve people with opioid use disorder. That being said, if you do have beds that are set aside or slots for people experiencing homelessness, we would want to count those. And please let us know so that we can coordinate with you in order to properly classify those beds, whether it's that you're paying for a hotel motel for someone, or it is more like a rapid rehousing project. So that's a great question. Thanks.
Anyone's having trouble viewing the webinar in this Skype call, I just put the link in the chat box, so hopefully folks can follow along if they're having trouble.
And if you are having trouble following along, we're now on slide 10.
Yep, slide 10. All right, so how do we get the info we need for the HIC? Right now we're reaching out to try to make sure we have the right contact person and the right programs. But during the week of the PIT count, we send out a link to an online survey. And every project type, whether you're emergency shelters, hotel, motel, vouchers, transitional housing, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, other permanent housing, must complete that online survey, even if your program is in HMIS. Because HMIS doesn't have every single detail that we need for the HIC. So the online survey has a lot of different information we need. Like Lee said, we need your total units and beds, how those are set up, your funding source, and how many folks are in the program. So please know that no matter what type of program you operate, if you operate one of those types of program, that will be coming your way. All right, moving on to the point in time count. Remember that the point in time count is about people, how many people were residing in programs the night of the PIT count. So this is specifically for emergency shelter and transitional housing programs. That includes TV shelters, also hotel, motel, voucher programs. So we get the information for the sheltered point in time count in a couple of different ways. One way we get it is from HMIS. Another way is from interview forms or from the mobile app, and I'll talk through what that means. If your program is in HMIS, you will be notified in advance of the PIT count whether your data quality passes a pre-test. What that means is we run a data quality check, and if your data is clean and has all the information we would need for the PIT count, then we don't need you to complete interview forms. We'll be able to use the data that's in HMIS to get all the info we need for the sheltered PIT count. Yay. If not, or if your program's not in HMIS, we will get the info from you using interview forms or the mobile app. So you will be asked to collect interview forms for every household that's in your program. And each form, you get information for all the members of that household. And then the other option, if you prefer, is you can use the mobile app. The nice thing is if you're an emergency shelter or transitional housing and you have computers in your program, you can pull it up on the computer and complete it with all the households in your program. I've been working on it with Brendan this week, and it's actually really easy and user-friendly, so it's a great option if you have some computer access in your program. And that's up to your program, whether you want to use the interview forms or the mobile app. Once you see Brendan's presentation, you'll get a better sense of what might work for you. So just a bit about what we need. You kind of give us your program information, which county you're from, which program. Then you do one interview form per household. If there's 5 people in the household, you fill it out for each of those 5 people on the same form. If there's more than 5 people in the household, you'd attach a second form. Each person, you interview them once, but they all go on that household's form. And then you designate someone at your program to collect all the forms and then return them to us. All right, now we're moving on. Most of the bulk of information moving forward is about the unsheltered pit count. But if you operate a homeless program, stay tuned because there's more info for you coming up in a little bit. Don't tune out too soon. So the unsheltered pit count, same date, January 22nd. Remember, this refers to the overnight hours on Wednesday evening through Thursday morning. This date cannot be changed by any county or RAB because the entire COC has to do the count on the same date. If you run into any major issues right around the pit count, there's a major blizzard going on, in your specific area, please reach out to us. We will talk to you about it. But just know that a rule of thumb is that we're all doing the pit count on the same date.
I will also just say that most likely in the event that there is a blizzard or something, either in a portion of the COC or covering the COC or the whole state for that matter, we probably would know that in advance.
Right.
And would probably call to change the date to the following Wednesday. When the 4th Wednesday is early enough in the year, like it is this year at the 22nd, we're able to still do it within the last 10 days of the month, just by postponing for 1 week. I just want to assure people who are new to this process, we would not just sort of willy-nilly change the date. We realize that there are lots and lots of people who have been tapped to volunteer and come together in your community on a given night to conduct the pit count. There's been a lot of work to coordinate with businesses and police and EMS and other folks. So that is not something we ever like to do. It would not do just sort of casually. It would have to be sort of like Jessica said, a blizzard or something quite extreme for us to cancel and reschedule and postpone the pit count.
The actual time of the count in your county will be determined by your planning team. So whether you're doing it in the overnight hours or whether you're doing it in the daytime, that will be a local decision. So the count includes individuals who are sleeping unsheltered. So that includes a lot of different types of sleeping situations. That could include folks who are sleeping outside, out of doors, vehicles, parks, tents, bus stations. There's some scenarios that sometimes might be a little bit gray. So something that might be an acceptable sleeping accommodation during warm weather might not be in January. So a hunting cabin, for example, might be acceptable in the summer, but it might not be in the winter if there's no heat. So those are kind of those gray areas where when in doubt, please just document as much information as possible on the form that you're filling out, and we can always talk through it afterwards. The problem we run into is when there's not any information documented on the form, and then we're trying to kind of make a decision without a lot of detail. So document the information, we can troubleshoot it afterwards. A lot of your county coordinators have a lot of expertise in this and kind of know the ropes, but we've also gone to HUD with scenarios and said, here's 5 scenarios we ran into this year. What do you think? How should we count these or not? So let us know if you run into situations like that.
And I know many of you coordinate with, for example, other county agencies or other homeless assistance programs and may know through that work or even through street outreach efforts of folks who are sort of living in this in between. Like, are they unsheltered or are they just living in a precarious situation? If you have any of those gray areas, like Jessica said, please reach out to us. We can certainly help you sort of pick that apart and think through it and come up with a good solution about whether or not to count the household. Sometimes those present themselves after the pit count because of what a volunteer identified during the pit count. We can certainly work to address those after the fact, but if you know of folks who are in this sort of gray space ahead of time, that works probably even better, just to help to not muddy the data with their information that you then have to pull back out. So, sorry.
Yep. So who does the unsheltered count not include? So it doesn't include people who are in shelter or hotels and motels, because those folks are actually counted through the sheltered count. So just a note about that. It doesn't count jails and prisons, emergency rooms, halfway houses, recovery houses, residential medical facilities, youth who are in foster care or other out-of-home placement, or folks who are doubled up. So it doesn't actually include folks who are kind of precariously housed or imminently at risk of homelessness. So folks who are behind on their rent or paying a really large portion of their rent, portion of their income towards rent, people who are in the process of being evicted, people who are staying with family and friends, or couch surfing or house hopping. Those folks are not included because for the purpose of the pit count, we're only counting folks who are what HUD considers literally homeless. So just a note for who we count during the pit count. Just a kind of like a interesting scenario that sometimes comes up. If you are doing the unsheltered pit count and you find someone and then you transport them to shelter because they need somewhere to stay that night, you should coordinate with that shelter about how they're going to be counted. They would then be considered sheltered for the night. So you need to make sure that you're not double counting them. So make sure that someone is surveying them. You could survey them and then say they were transported to ABC shelter, or you can say to the shelter, please make sure you survey them tonight. Just make sure that that's coordinated so they're not counted twice.
Right. And if you do have someone who you have interviewed, and at the end of the interview you offer to transport them to shelter, and they accept that, you don't have to reconduct the interview. If you're using the paper version, you can certainly just write something across the top that indicates either they accepted a hotel motel voucher or that you transported them to ABC shelter. The other thing I'll just reiterate, something that Jessica said several slides ago, is that the way we have seen this a few times is among these bullet points here, the residential or medical facilities. If that facility has a bed or a handful of beds that are set aside for people experiencing homelessness, we wouldn't count them under the unsheltered count, but we would certainly be able to count them as part of the sheltered count.
There's a question about why a homeless person at the ER would not be counted. It's a good question.
So it's a great question. I think the issue is, where did they sleep overnight? So if they were identified in the ER at, let me think this through. If you were conducting your count on Thursday and found someone and said, where did you sleep last night? And they said, at the hospital, I had to go to the emergency room and I was admitted to the hospital. I was released again this morning. They did not technically, quote unquote, sleep on the street that night. They didn't sleep in shelter. Now, as part of your unsheltered count, if you go to an emergency room because you know that the emergency room allows for folks to sit in the lobby, for example, they would, and they're literally there to get warm. That would be sort of an example of a service-based count. The hospital or the emergency room is allowing folks to sort of be sheltered there, even though they're not sleeping or anything like that. If you have a situation like that, we should probably sort of discuss some more of the nuances of that question. There's further a request for information here It says, but if they weren't admitted, would they count? If they were getting medical treatment at a hospital, they would not count. If they were released, if they were in the emergency room for 2 hours and released back to the street, most likely they would count. And so it is that nuanced. I don't mean to make it cryptic because it's not, it's certainly not. But the intent here is to count folks who slept in a sheltered location or an unsheltered location that night. I can already imagine the next question being, what if they didn't sleep the night before because they were at the hospital? Again, the intention here is to count folks who are sleeping in a sheltered or unsheltered location. If they were receiving medical treatment, they would not count. I always hear, but we had 2 people this night and 0 people the next night. And I understand that happens. It happens all across the state and the country, frankly, where one day you may have 2 people who were homeless and now they're in the county jail for 30 days, or they were homeless and now they're in the emergency room. And what I can tell you is that there were also 2 people in the hospital that were released back to the street, or 2 people in the county jail who were released back to the street or shelter. So the idea is that you're going to get sort of a consistent count. It doesn't count everyone. We don't make up the rules. I understand some of the frustration around that, but that's, like I said, we're happy to sort of talk through more of the nuances.
I see more questions. I think we could probably spend a ton of time talking through like individual scenarios on this slide. Monica, I see your question about someone who was unsheltered part of the night and then they stayed at a friend's house. I think that's another one where we might have to talk it through after the count and maybe even talk to HUD about it, because I think that's an interesting one. But I want to move on if that's okay, Lee.
Yeah.
Just because we have a lot to get through, but that's a super good question, Monica. And Ronald, I appreciate your comment about libraries, often a place where folks seek some warmth and shelter. Unsheltered count, the methodology. So there's a couple different methodologies that folks can use for conducting the count. So we're going to talk through each one in detail. So the street-based count, and there's a couple ways you can do that. The service-based count and the come and be counted location. So we're going to talk through each of these methodologies, and often folks use a combination of these. So a street-based count, it's really just shorthand for doing your count in any location that's not a place where folks that are not intended for folks to sleep at. So doing basically a count that's outside. It's conducted by walking or driving through your community, seeking to identify folks experiencing homelessness. So there's a couple ways you could do that. You could do a complete coverage. So that's attempting to cover your entire community and count unsheltered folks across an entire county or cover specific portions of the county. That might mean you're only looking at the habitable portions of your county. You're not going into, wooded areas, but you're covering every habitable part of your community. Known locations is when you count locations where folks tend to congregate who are experiencing homelessness, or a combination. You might do a complete coverage on the area, maybe in your urban center in your community, and you might do known locations in maybe the more suburban or rural parts of your community. So this is a community decision. What is the methodology that's going to make sense? In a very, very large county, a complete coverage may not be realistic, and you may know that there are parts of your county that there are no folks that you're going to find. But in other areas that are very highly concentrated with people, a complete coverage may be necessary. So that should be a decision based on your knowledge of your community.
And your capacity for conducting the pit count. If you've got 3 volunteers to cover your county, complete coverage may not be feasible with boots on the ground or tires on the gravel, meaning either by foot or car, you may not be able to cover the whole county. There are other ways that you can have more complete coverage by partnering with EMS and police and other folks in your community that are sort of strategically scattered throughout the COC. That's certainly not what's the meaning of complete coverage by any means, but there are ways, especially in large rural communities, where you can get maximized coverage based on your capacity.
Mm-hmm. So the count has to capture where someone slept the night of January 22nd. Some folks do it overnight and some do it the following day. If you're doing it overnight on January 22nd, it's either where are they sleeping when you encounter them, or where will you sleep tonight if you're doing it at, say, 10 o'clock p.m. to 12 o'clock a.m. If you're doing it on January 23rd during the day, you're going to say, where did you sleep last night? And we actually have two different versions of the interview form that you can use depending on when you're conducting the surveys in your community. A service-based count is when you're targeting specific locations in your community where you know folks experiencing homelessness may receive services or may congregate, and doing your interviews there. That might be a drop-in center, a soup kitchen, food pantries, social service programs. There is a separate interview form that you can use for the service-based count, or you can do some sort of combination. You can do a street-based count and a service-based count. There is a question that says, have you already been surveyed by someone else? And if they have, you don't complete another survey, just so that we're not duplicating efforts. We'll get into a little bit in a minute about duplication, making sure there's no duplication, because it does get a little bit tricky when you kind of have a combination methodology about duplication. So we'll get into that in a minute.
I'm not sure if this is on the next slide or if Jessica just said this. I don't remember that she did. But if you are conducting a service-based count, you must conduct it the day after the pig count. Again, rather than there we go.
Leah's anticipating.
Sorry.
All of them. So that's good though. Yes, must be on January 23rd. All right, another methodology, it's similar to a service-based count, but with a twist, is a come and be counted location, which is typically used when working with youth and trying to accurately count youth experiencing homelessness. And it's typically, it might be an event or some type of advertised activity to try to more accurately capture youth experiencing homelessness. The reason why folks in some communities have done these type of events is because we know youth homelessness often is hidden, and often young people are not counted very accurately during the pit count because they're not often in the exact same locations that maybe adults are who are experiencing homelessness. So with the come and be counted site, you can select a location based on input from youth where youth might congregate. That might be a after school activities that they participate in. Some communities might have drop-in programming, and then you advertise the date and location to youth for youth to come and be counted. We'll talk a little bit more later about engaging youth for the pit count and kind of some strategies for that. So who is the youth homeless definition the same? For the purpose of the pit count, youth is defined as young people ages 24 and under, but the definition is the same for the pit count. So it's folks who are literally homeless, unsheltered, or in emergency shelter or transitional housing. There are efforts in some communities to more accurately count youth using a broader definition, but for the purpose of the pit count, yes, we're only looking at youth who are experiencing literal homelessness, who are unsheltered or in shelter. Unsheltered count, it captures these different household configurations. So whether it's families with children, couples who might be married or unmarried, single individuals, and youth, which folks we were just talking about. That could include youth who are unaccompanied, so youth under 18 who are on their own, unaccompanied youth ages 18 to 24, or parenting youth who could be age 24 and under. So those are the household types that we capture during the pit count. Household, you'll see, is a term that we use throughout these slides. household is the unit, is any of these types of configurations of folks who might stay or live together. Each household is counted once and only once, and then we capture each person's information underneath that household. So I hope that makes sense.
And a household can really define whether or not they're a household.
Correct.
You don't have to get into the weeds and ask lots of questions for clarification. If Jessica and I, the night of the pig count, were counted on the street together and said we're a couple and we're sisters or cousins or whatever our relationship is, that's something that you can report it as is.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to get into nuances, but are you friends? Are you a couple? Like, it doesn't matter. If we self-define as a household, then we are.
Yep. So some guiding principles for the unsheltered count is safety. Safety for both your volunteers who are counting folks and also for folks who are being interviewed. We do provide a PowerPoint to help folks train volunteers in their community, and we go in much more detail about safety, but it's really important to kind of give some parameters for your volunteers around how to keep themselves safe and also how to approach folks in like a safe and dignified a way that respects them and honors their dignity and worth. And not anonymity, we don't collect personally identifying information for folks, and folks can decline to answer any of the information that we ask them. So we don't collect date of birth, social security numbers, names. We ask for folks' initials, ages if they're willing to provide them, that sort of thing. But we don't collect information like that so that we can help people remain anonymous. We do try to get complete information, so we collect as much information as folks are willing to provide. Each person counted, so we try to really conduct a thorough count in each community, and each person counted once. We are going to go into deduplication and how we make sure we're not counting folks more than once. Actually, we're going to go into that right now. Unsheltered count. So there's a section on the PIT count interview form. It's actually right at the top that says that you can, if you are unable to survey an individual that you believe is experiencing homelessness, you can complete some information by observation. So what do you observe about this person? And you can count them by observation only, meaning you didn't survey them, but you believe they're experiencing homelessness. So some general guidelines. We don't want to really do a lot of guesswork and say, like they kind of look homeless, because that really gets into some tricky territory, because it's really hard to tell whether folks are experiencing homelessness or not. So some general guidelines. We should really only be doing a count by observation only if you are doing a street count and that individual is asleep or bedded down. So you are outdoors and they are asleep or bedded down. That is a fair time to do a count by observation only. Second is the individual or household is unwilling to be interviewed or complete the full interview, but you believe them to be experiencing homelessness based on the facts that you can observe. For example, they're on a park bench, it's the middle of winter, and they have all of their belongings with them. Or you know that person, you work in this community, you have been, working in the social service sector, and you know this person, you know their kind of history of homelessness, for example. If you're conducting a service-based count, in many cases, an observation-only count is not going to be appropriate because they might have slept in a shelter overnight last night, or they might have been on the streets last night, and you can't know that without actually surveying them. This is a great comment that someone made. They did an observation count of a man sleeping in a truck. He had all his belongings. That's an example, and I'm going to go on the next slide because the main key with doing an observation count is we need as much detail as possible. So you really need to document why you believe that they are experiencing homelessness and what you observed about them. The reason why is because we don't want to count that person twice. So we need to know a little bit of detail. So what were they wearing? What did they look like? They were wearing a black beanie, jeans, tan utility boots, or if they were bedded down, they were in a red tent with a gray sleeping bag, or whatever the case may be. What did they look like? If you give this detail, if you have a street outreach worker in your community, they may very well know exactly who it is that you're talking about. Why were you unable to complete a survey? They didn't want to, but they were awake. They were asleep. Where did you see them? Giving some like pretty concrete details about where and what makes you think they were experiencing homelessness. They were sleeping outside. They had a bag of their belongings with them. The example that April gave in the comments, they were asleep in their truck with all of their belongings. Like that's an example of why. When is an observational survey not appropriate? I saw a man in a red sweatshirt riding by on a bike that looked homeless. Why is that not an appropriate observational survey? We really don't have enough detail to go off of. So we don't know their age, their appearance, their location, why you believe that they're experiencing homelessness. Someone's appearance really isn't enough to go off of. We need like a little bit more facts. And then we also don't know whether they were already counted. We don't know if maybe they stayed in a shelter the previous night or they might have been counted by another team, that sort of thing. So when in doubt, give as much information as possible because it's really hard after the fact to try to parse through whether to count someone or not without a lot of detail.
And one other, there's nowhere to write this, so when these things happen, I would say just write it anywhere on your form. But last year we got a series of forms from one particular county, and the intention here, if this is your county, is not to call you out, but I think it's a good example of folks who did a really good job on the PIT count, but it still ended up causing some confusion on our end. I think that there may have been half a dozen or more blue tents counted behind a Walmart or a Big Lots or something like that. And so we're reading the information, and of course everybody's asleep. And so the interview forms were completed as observation, and it's like blue tent behind Walmart, blue tent behind Walmart. So suddenly we realized we have 6 forms that all say blue tent behind Walmart, and it was unclear, and in some cases was not the same handwriting. So it took some digging around to find out, okay, there were 6 tents behind Walmart that were blue on that night. This is not a repeat form by various folks counting the same person. So if you find yourself in that situation, feel free to write down on one of the forms, there were 6 blue tents behind the Walmart, which will end up helping us later. So thank you for that.
Mm-hmm. All right. So we're not going to go through the survey, but just some of the information we collect is how many people were in the household, some basic demographics, age, gender, ethnicity, race. And then other information that HUD requires, if the person is willing to give it to you, is the number of homeless episodes they've had, how long they've been homeless, DV history, disability, and veteran status. We don't ask date of birth specifically because there have been some guidance from HUD and others that can be a safety risk, especially for DV survivors. So the more information we can get from you in other areas, the more we can work on deduplication. Speaking of DV, last year there was a detailed presentation from PCADV about how to engage folks experiencing DV or fleeing DV. So those training materials are on the COC PIT website. But there are some specific questions that are asked that we just wanted to go over. So we ask folks first of all, if 2 adults are together in the same household, we just ask you to skip this question altogether for safety reasons. But we ask, did you need to leave the place you were last staying due to someone making you feel unsafe? Did you feel unable to return? So we ask that, and then if they're feeling unsafe, we ask if they would like to talk to someone and refer them to the DV hotline. If they're yes to feeling unsafe, then we have some other questions that are in the survey but we ask them before we proceed with the survey. So if they want to say, I just want to end the survey now, then we give them the option of ending the survey right then. So again, there's more training materials available for folks if this may be new to you or you want a refresher. All right, so just a quick reminder, ask all the questions as they're written on the interview form or in the mobile app. Inform participants that participation is voluntary. They can refuse some or all of the questions, and if they refuse, that doesn't result in denial of any services. If they don't want to participate, the interview form or the mobile app will direct you to collect information based on observation. You may be able to observe some of the demographic information. It may be guesswork. You're like, I believe that this person is a white female. If you don't know, it's okay to write don't know. But for example, they're bedded down, you cannot see them, but do as much as you can. And if the person refuses to give initials, you can assign them initials. And for disability status, we just ask that you don't kind of dig into their answers, just take their answers, record them. That's true for the whole survey. Just ask the survey questions. We're not really digging into people's responses. All right, now we're moving on to some more general guidance. There's a really huge emphasis from HUD and in our COCs about counting unsheltered veterans. The Western PA COC recently declared an effective end to veterans homelessness. It doesn't mean you won't find any veterans experiencing homelessness in your community. It just means there's an effective system to quickly house veterans experiencing homelessness, which is great. Congrats to those folks. So there's a focus on that. So for the unsheltered count, if someone has served in the U.S. Armed Forces or is activated into active duty as a member of the National Guard or reservist, they would be counted as a veteran. So we encourage folks to coordinate with their local veteran service organizations and coordinate with veterans to identify unsheltered locations and participate during the unsheltered count to more effectively count and serve veterans experiencing homelessness. We also have an emphasis on counting youth. Like we mentioned before, youth don't necessarily stay or congregate in the same locations as adults. So we ask that counties are coordinating with other systems that serve youth, that there's specific efforts to engage young people, especially around where are the hotspots, where might youth be congregating. Plan with safety in mind and provide local training. There is a document on the PIT website about standards for counting youth that gives tips and descriptions of all of these guidelines. So we encourage you to check that out. There's actually a lot of resources that we just uploaded to the website. So if you're new to this and you're like, I don't know where to start, we uploaded some guidance that hopefully will help you hit the ground running. And we're also a resource as well. We did reach out to the state Education for Children and Youth Experiencing Homelessness, ECHIA program. They have a very mouthful acronym, but basically the folks who serve students experiencing homelessness, they're aware of the PIT date, and many of you already coordinate with those folks to help identify families or youth experiencing homelessness. So we just encourage you, if you're not already working with youth serving organizations or partners, to keep that in mind, because those are folks who already know a lot about where youth are in your community or how to engage youth. So we encourage you to do that. There are a lot of partners in your community who can help you with your unsheltered PIT count. Many of you already know this and do this, but first of all, people who've experienced homelessness have deep expertise in how to engage or identify folks. Local government officials, community leaders, local funders. Folks do engage with law enforcement, not necessarily to go out and count, because sometimes that might be intimidating, but to help identify where folks are, or even like around some safety guidance. I think Chris might touch on that a little bit later. Local colleges and universities, the media, obviously homeless and community service partners, federal partners, faith-based community. There's tons of folks who can help out with your count. So that it doesn't all fall on one or a couple of folks.
Absolutely.
So like I said, if you're new to this and this feels overwhelming or you're not sure where to go next, we just uploaded this resource called the 2020 booklet for the Unsheltered Point in Time Count on the PIT website that has tons of resources, especially for new folks. It has a lot of templates. How do I reach out to my community partners? How do I train volunteers? What should my agenda be? That sort of thing. We also uploaded all the interview forms, the summary form, which I'll get into in a minute. We put together a PowerPoint training each year. DMA has done that, and we just updated it a bit to help you train your volunteers. If you're an unsheltered coordinator, and then like all the archived webinars. So if you haven't gone to the PIT website yet, check it out. It's updated and will continue to be updated with all these resources.
And I'll just add that if you have materials that you think are the bee's knees, that are just really the best templates, forms, media, flyers, whatever you've got, feel free to send those to us, and we can also post them and or incorporate them into the next version of the booklet for folks to use. But we could certainly include other resources that you're proud of, that you think are really effective, so that others can replicate that and save some time in their community.
Mm-hmm. Also, HUD put out some really cool materials this year for the PIT count, like here's a tip sheet for volunteers that you can edit, like what to bring with you the night of the count, reminders. So they're actually really cool resources that are also on our PIT page. So check those out as well. So it's good because you don't have to start from scratch. There's a lot of tools so you can edit. You don't have to, create materials from zero, which is, I always like taking other people's things in and updating them rather than starting from zero. All right, we're just about to sum up everything you just heard in a roles and responsibilities. If you just heard all of that and you're like, that was too much information, I'm so unclear on what my role is in the PIT count, we're going to sum it up for you. And we're also going to give you some clarity on deadlines. When are things due? So if you're a county unsheltered PIT coordinator, here's your role. Your role is to gather folks around you. It's not your role to do everything. Establish a committee of volunteers in your county. Decide what your methodology is going to be. Is it a street count, a service-based count, some combination of methods? Train your volunteers once you establish them. That's required by HUD. It should be done close to the count. It doesn't really help to train folks in November if they're not going to be doing the count until January. So we recommend like a week, within the week of the count, so it's fresh in people's minds. Those slides are already posted on the PIT count page, and we sent them out to the unsheltered coordinators. Again, if you are an unsheltered coordinator and haven't been getting my emails, my email will be up. Or our email will be up in a minute. So the volunteer committee has a lot of roles, and this doesn't all fall to the county unsheltered coordinator, but each county should be working to outreach to different folks like youth organizations, school districts, veteran service organizations, notifying police or first responders about the count. Maybe you want the media aware of what's going on. Obviously, recruiting volunteers and deciding what volunteers are going to do, communicating with volunteers prior to the PIT so they know what to expect, mapping out which teams are going to go to specific areas to prevent overlap and duplication. Chris is going to talk in a little bit about kind of how they did that in Cumberland County. If your county is using the app, letting folks know how to access that, which Brendan will talk about, coordinating with coordinated entry folks, maybe getting donations if you want to give out care packages, a transportation plan. If you run into someone who desperately needs shelter, what's your plan in your community? That's going to vary.
Or if you run into somebody who has really significant health needs, if you've got someone and their health really does not look well, they've been outside in the freezing cold for days and days, having some form of a transportation plan will be really helpful.
Getting your supplies together. So what do people need? Do they need pens, flashlights, that kind of thing? Making copies of the interview forms, and then kind of just coordinating day of logistics. So where are people going to meet on the day of? Where are people going to drop things off? All that good stuff. Again, it's not all on the coordinator. There's probably a lot of folks in your community who could support. So after the count, your role is by February 14th, 2020, Valentine's Day. Submit all the interview forms, one per household, if you're doing them on paper, to DMA. The information on where to submit that is on the forms themselves, like our address or email address. Complete and submit what's called the county summary form. It's basically like, how did things go in your community? What did you do? And some other information to kind of sum up your count. That's like one form that you have to submit, whether you use the paper surveys or the app. The number of households that you report on your summary form. So you say we counted 50 households, we should get 50 interview forms back. If your volunteers are using the mobile app, we will get the surveys automatically via the mobile app, so you don't have to worry about submitting the interview forms. Just a little plug for the mobile app. One less thing to do. So I'm going to remind you that to remember the date that they're due is that we would love to get your forms back by Valentine's Day. So if you can't remember the deadline, we would love to get your forms back by Valentine's Day. All right. If you are a housing provider, any housing provider, emergency shelter, transitional, rapid, permanent supportive housing, other permanent housing, that your role is to complete the housing inventory chart online survey. The week of the pit count, you'll get a link. We need that from you. We will let you know when the deadline for that is. If your program's in HMIS, we still need it from you. So that's your role. And if you're an emergency shelter or a transitional housing provider, we need that plus the pit count interview information. So remember, we said that if we can use your HMIS data, we'll let you know. If not, we will need interview forms, or you can use the mobile app. So emergency shelter and transitional housing providers, you do the online survey plus the pit count. So that's what we need. And lastly, if you're a community partner, we love you. We're so happy that you're listening in, and we'd love for you to get involved. I'm sure your county coordinator would love to have you involved if you're not already. There are most likely opportunities for you to volunteer, maybe conducting surveys, possibly assembling care packages, maybe spreading the word in your community. If you don't know how to get involved, let me know. I can connect you with your county coordinator, and we'll see what kind of ideas they have for how you can get involved. That's our information. Remember this email, pahomelesscount@dmahousing.com, dma-housing.com. If you don't know who your county coordinator is, email pahomelesscount@dma-housing.com, and I will get back to you with that, because I don't want to tell you that now, because there's 53 counties, and that would take me a while to get through. And yes, there is a way to take notes in the app. The email to email is pahomelesscount@dma-housing.com. And Brendan will be going through the app in just a minute to show everyone how to take notes and all that good stuff.
And if you didn't get the email address written down, it's on slide 41 of the PowerPoint.
Yep. So we're going to pass it to Brendan. After Brendan, it's going to go to Chris, and then we'll come back and do more questions at the end. So we're going to pass it over to Brendan.
All right, thank you, Jessica and Lee, for that information. So good morning, everyone. This is Brendan Auman at DCED. I'm going to be showing you the app that I've been working on in coordination with DMA. Last year was the first year that we started piloting this, and I hope to get it going in full force for this year, have more people participate in using it, because I think it is a really helpful tool, and it really helps on the back end with DMA and our data people to sort everything and get it submitted to HUD, because it collects all that data and filters it online seamlessly. Does not have to shifting through papers to make sure that everything is in there, all answers, our questions are answered, etc. So just a little bit of detail. The app is created through Esri. They have a suite called ArcGIS, and one of the programs in that suite is called Survey 123. And this was a program that was actually recommended by HUD to use for the pit count. So Survey 123 and the people over at Esri, they gave a couple tutorials to show how to use this software, and it's come out pretty well, I think. So what I'm going to do is just give you a brief introduction on how to do a couple different surveys throughout it. I'll show you one for an unsheltered count, maybe I'll show you a sheltered count, and then how to do the observation form through the app. So again, just a little detail on this. What I'll be doing is probably the week of the count, I will share with everyone a link that you can click on, and that will take you to the survey. Now, there's a couple different options on how to administer the survey, because you can do it for both the sheltered and the unsheltered count. So with the link, it'll give you the option to either open the survey in the app directly. So you can go ahead and download the app through your app store. You'll just look for Survey 123 in whatever mobile device you're using, whether that's iPhone or Android. It will work for both. And if you don't want to download the app, you don't have to. It'll also give you the option to open it up on your mobile device's browser, so just an internet tab, and you can administer it that way as well. Whereas if you're a shelter and you have a office computer, you can just open it up right on the browser in your computer. So I'm doing this on my computer, but this will look very similar, almost identical to what it will look like in the actual app when you open it. So you'll see right here, 2020 pit count. Don't ignore the thumbnail. There's not a more current picture that I found at this time. Hopefully I can update that. But you'll open it, and you'll see down here at the bottom, it says collect. So we're going to start collecting some information. So this is what it'll initially look like. It'll automatically put in the date and the time that you're completing the survey, so you don't have to worry about that part at all. And the first thing it'll do is ask you to put in your name. So I will go ahead and do that. And then I'll ask which COC are you completing the survey in. For my example, I'll select Eastern. And with the app, I'll just backtrack a second. If you scroll down and look through everything real quick, what's available to you, there's not a lot of information. That's because the survey integrates some logic. So depending on what answer you select, more questions will pop up. So that's something to just be aware of. Make sure you answer every question in order so that the appropriate logic is fulfilled and the questions come up in the order that they're supposed to. So just moving on again, I'll select Eastern COC, and then the logic will come up and ask which county you're completing the survey in. So for this example, I'll just select Cambria County. Throughout the app and the survey, even if you compare it to the paper form, because they are identical, you'll see some scripts that you'll be prompted to read. So for example, it'll have the interviewer. That's when you kind of know that there's something that you need to read and look over, and it'll ask you to read this script right here to the person you were conducting the interview with. So I won't go ahead and read that out loud, but that's just something to note if you choose to use the app. And then I'll go to the next question. Can I have 10 minutes of your time? So if they answer yes, you can interview them. You'll hit yes. But to begin the observation form, or they don't want to be interviewed, you'll just hit no. That'll begin the observation portion of the survey. But for this example, we'll just go ahead and hit yes. They can have 10 minutes of your time, and then again, it'll ask you the next question. Did someone else already ask you where you were staying tonight? If someone already asked them and you click yes, it'll just ask where was the survey given, and then it'll prompt you to submit the survey by clicking this down here, and that'll be the end of it because they were already surveyed. But for this example, we'll just assume that they were not surveyed. So here's something that's different a little bit from last year, this language here, because it depends on when you're administering the survey. If you're administering it the night of the January 22nd, you'll ask them, where are you sleeping tonight? However, if you're providing the survey on the next day, January 23rd, you will ask them, where did you sleep last night? So then in the category, you're prompted, do not read the categories. And just hearing their response, you'll select the most appropriate response. For this example, we'll do woods or outdoor encampment. And then it'll ask you to please provide a brief description of where the household is sleeping. And just going back to what Jessica said during their portion of the presentation, you want to be as descriptive as possible. So we'll say blue tent behind Walmart with we'll say dog in 10. I don't know. I'm just trying to make something up off the top of my head, but try to be as descriptive as possible where you found the household sleeping. Okay, so then I'll ask how many adults are in the household, and again, that's people over the age of 18 or older. So for this example, I'll put 2 people, 2 adults, and 1 child were sleeping in that tent. So then we'll move on to the household questions, where it'll ask you, what are your initials? So you'll start by doing this. You'll see here, it asks you to go from the oldest person in the household down to the youngest person in the household. So we'll start with the oldest person. We'll say his initials are TY. And you will ignore these first 2 questions. It says here, skip for person 1. Skip for person 1 for these first 2. So again, just make sure you're reading everything in full so you can understand the exact question. So in this, it'll ask how old are you. Before, you would just put in the range that that they're telling us. However, for this survey this year, we'll select exact age known, and you want to put in exactly how old that person is that you were interviewing. And just a little note, this is pretty close to being the final product. There might be a couple extra tweaks in there. For example, I might move this exact age known up to the top of the list, just so it stands out. So we'll go ahead and answer the rest of the questions that it asks. You'll see in some instances it'll say select all that apply, so that means you can select more than one. What is your gender? I'll give you some options, and again, if they refuse to answer or they aren't willing to answer, you can always select don't know refused. That should be available for all questions. So here's where it gets a little tricky. Depending on how many people are you put in that you're interviewing. For example, 2 adults, 1 child, there's 3 people. You need to complete this section for all 3 of those people. You'll see right here there's a little box that says 1 of 3. So these questions will repeat for however many people you answer you're interviewing. So you just want to make sure you go and do all of them. So move on to the next person. We'll say that this is the person's spouse. Are you staying in the same location? Because we skip for person 1, we are going to answer that for person 2. We know their exact age. We'll say that they're 45. And we'll go ahead and just keep going and answering these questions. Move on to the third person. This will be person under 18 or a child in this instance, since this will be the youngest. And you'll also notice next to each question, if there's an asterisk, that means it is required. Most of these questions will be required to be answered. If not, it'll take you back and make sure that you answered those questions. So I did answer all of those for all 3 people. The next question goes into the chronic determination. And you only want to ask these to people, the head of households or the adults in the household, unless they are a head of household who's a child, who might be under 18. You might not encounter too many of those instances, but again, this will repeat for at least all the adults that were in that household. So it'll ask you, when did you sleep in one of the following locations, house or apartment, yada yada, and you just go ahead and answer them as they respond. So with this one, this is how we kind of come up with the chronic determination. Actually, it looks like some of the logic isn't working. If they answer 4+ times, this question should pop up. It was working before, so I'll need to go back and review that, which is why this is just a test product. But again, you'll just go through and answer it for each of the individuals who were listed as adults. To the next questions, again, this is where Jessica mentioned, for the safety reasons, if there are more than 2 adults in the household, you will skip. So for this example, I will select did not ask because there were 2 adults. But I'll just show you through in the instance that there is maybe 1 adult and they select yes. Again, the logic will populate where it'll prompt you to say if you would like to speak with someone, yes. And this will ask if they want to continue the survey, if they answer yes to feeling unsafe. But we'll just say continue for this example. So this is when it goes into more of the questions about some of their history. Do they drink alcoholic beverages? Do they have psychotic or psychiatric emotional conditions? Do they have a physical disability? If they answer yes to any of these 3, the logic will fulfill and ask, do any of these situations we discussed keep you from holding a job? If they select yes, it'll ask you which ones are preventing you from holding a job or living in a stable housing. So again, we'll just continue through here. And then here's the last part that has some logic included in it. Did you serve in active duty? If they select yes, it'll prompt you to have them call the VA's National Call Center. So go ahead and complete this for the next individual. Since there were 2 adults, you only ask these questions for the adults. Then I'm just going ahead and fill them out randomly. And then the last question is there anything else you want to tell me about your housing experience? If they want to mention anything, they can go ahead and tell you. And then the last part of the survey is the location. So this is kind of helpful when we are looking at the data at the end result. It creates a hotspot that shows exactly where all the surveys were completed. So one thing to keep in mind is using the desktop, it hasn't really been accurate for me. So I'll go ahead and click on it and it'll show me in Hershey, Pennsylvania, where I'm actually way over here in Harrisburg. So I don't know why it does this. On the app, if you're actually using the app on your phone, it works just fine. But if you're using a desktop, sometimes it does get a little jacked up. It's not required to have it accurate. It's just a nice little addition to reviewing the data when we submit it. So you can just click and drag and put the pin to where you think about your location is, and then just hit the check mark. So once all the questions are answered, you'll just go ahead and hit survey completed, the check mark at the bottom. So here's where it actually gives you an interesting little option here. You can choose to send it later. So let's say you are out in the field doing a street survey and you don't have any service because you're out in the woods. If you don't have service, you can hit send later and it'll actually save it. So when you get service, you can go back in, open that same survey and submit it once you're able to get service again. So that's one little helpful trick that the app gives you. But you can also just hit send now. So we'll go ahead, send the information, and you are actually able, or you should be able, to go in and let's say you submitted a survey and you realize you might have answered a question wrong. You can actually go into your sent folders send folders and look at the surveys that you have already submitted, and you can go back in and edit them. So that's another helpful little hint. Hopefully you won't get to that point, because it looks like you might have to enter some of the data again, but you really shouldn't have to. But actually it looks like some of the questions did not save, so I'll have to look into that. So don't do that. Don't actually go in and edit until I get that fixed. So I'll just go ahead and exit it. So I'll just give you another example of an observation form. I'll go ahead and put in my name again. I'll complete this in the West. I'll be in Butler County. Can I have 10 minutes of your time? Even if you don't ask that, you just you see someone staying over there that you can't survey, you just hit no and go ahead and start the observation portion of the survey. It'll ask you for the number of adults that you see. For this example, I'll just put 1, and then the logic will come up. Will ask you to answer the questions about what you observe about that individual. And it'll do the same for children. I'll just do 1. What is their gender? Not sure. Go ahead and just fill that out as best as possible. And then here's where we also want you to get as specific as possible about where you're finding that individual. So 2 family household sleeping on the corner of 5th or 4th and Spruce, wearing blue jackets and black pants, just for an example. Again, the location, it's not quite right. It should be, if you're doing it on your phone, it should be a little bit more accurate. You don't have to adjust it if you don't want to. It's just, again, a helpful little help trick. And I'll just go ahead and send now. So that's basically the gist of it. I'll just show you one other little thing, kind of what it looks like on the back end. Once we get all the data, we can go to Analyze, and it'll show you some of the answers to the questions or some of the responses. But here's what it looks like on the map that were submitted. For example, this is the one I just sent. It'll show it on the map and kind of show a hotspot to help kind of review where we're finding people. So I know there's a couple questions, I believe, during the presentation. It doesn't look like there's any questions, but if you have anything, feel free to send me an email. What I'll do here, once I have a final or a little bit closer to a final product, I'll send out a link to a test so you can actually get your hands on it and mess around with it before you actually decide whether or not you want to use the app for this pit count period. And just a reminder, you should choose one or the other. You should either use the pit paper forms or the app. So coordinators, if you want to review that and come up with what your plan is and what you want to use before you make that decision, you can test it out. So that's really all I have. So at this point, I will turn it back over to Chris Kapp to have her continue on her portion of the presentation.
All right, thanks, Brendan. And you're going to load up my PowerPoint?
Yeah, I can do that for you.
Cool, thank you.
Just give me 1 second.
Not a problem. I'm actually going to be talking about some best practices, some things that we did here in Cumberland County to revamp our pit count and to streamline it and make sure that we were getting as systematic of a count done as possible. Which was it was very successful last year, and we had quite the response. That was actually more of a response than we've had in the past. So here we go. Let's plan the pit, and this is mostly for county coordinators. So Jessica was talking about doing either a full coverage or a hotspot coverage or a service-based count. We did a little bit of both. We did a combination in Cumberland County. We do a night count and a day count. We start on Wednesday night and go generally from 8 to 11. And then pick it up on Thursday morning as well, to cover anyone that we may have missed the night before. So when I took over the pit count, I realized that, Cumberland County is a huge area, and we have everything from very rural and wooded areas, which are on this slide outlined in the reddish maroon color. And then we have population centers that are fairly concentrated and urban-ish, at the very least dense suburbs. And those are the yellow blocks. So the first thing I did, and if you're new to being a county coordinator, it can be really overwhelming, but it doesn't have to be. It's like eating a whale. Planning a pit's like eating a whale. You just have to do it one step and one bite at a time. The first thing I did was I went to Google Maps, and I got a map of my county and divided it up. I looked at it, and this is what you're seeing on the right. I looked at it as a whole and divided it up amongst population centers and rural areas. And then within each of those yellow blocks, I broke it down even more, which is what you're seeing on the left, the little graphic on the left. The graphic on the left is actually the town where I live. It's Carlisle. It's a fairly small town. It's only about 2 miles square, and we broke down that population center into 5 separate zones, so that not one person is trying to go, oh my gosh, I've got to systematically cover the entire county. Once you break down your county into these different zones and into different locations and areas and manageable sections, it helps you with a couple things. It helps you know where to look, and it also helps you know how many volunteers you're going to need to have good coverage. If you could advance the slide, Brendan. Thanks. So once I had broken our county down into all of these areas, I went even smaller within each area to see where the hot spots might be. And Google Maps will be your new pit count best friend. Google Maps and I are BFFs. You can get really nuanced and detailed by zooming in on Google Maps. So what I did for each of those locations, I broke it down into search areas. For example, Carlisle has 5 different search areas, and each team covers 1 search area. So right now you're looking at the Enola search area, and using Google Maps, using good old-fashioned driving around, walking around, etc., we developed a list of places to look. One of the things you can do is work with your local coordinated entry person or regional manager or your access sites to access the coordinated entry data. In every VI SPDAT that is given within coordinated entry, there is a question at the end: where can we find you on a given day? One of the things I did was I went through every single VSPDAT that was given in our county and looked at that question: where can we find you? And I used that to also find patterns and places that people hang out. Jessica mentioned earlier as well law enforcement. I don't recommend having law enforcement count for you, because that can put up a barrier. People hide from law enforcement. People don't trust law enforcement. However, law enforcement can be a they can be a real ally for the pit count. And I would recommend reaching out to your local police chiefs association. Most counties have one, and your local state police office to not only find out, not only let them know that the point in time is happening, because it's important that local law enforcement know that we're going to be, you know, crawling around parks and in places that might not be open after dark, and we don't want our volunteers to be, you know, arrested or harassed. But also asking them, I went to the Police Chief Association's monthly meeting and asked them, you know, can you please ask your officers where the hot spots are, where we could find people, and explained to them the importance of the point in time and how it affects funding and how it affects how homelessness is dealt with in our area. And once you get them to buy into why we're doing the count, they are often incredibly helpful and a wealth of resources as far as knowing where people are hanging out. Our state police headquarters here in Cumberland County was able to let us know about people who were staying in places in extremely rural areas that we never would have thought to check. So we were able to add things like the game lands and specific underpasses on the turnpike, and places like that that we wouldn't have normally thought to look or had the capacity to look. But because the state police said, yeah, we know that this is a normal location and this is their typical spot, we were able to get them counted that night. We actually had a couple officers volunteer on their night off in plain clothes to count, not as a cop, but as a person. So they're also a good resource possibly for volunteers as well. You're also going to want to look for volunteers not just in your law enforcement, not just in your typical social service agencies, although your LHOT should be or your local housing task force or your homeless coalition should be a really good first go-to to try to get some buy-in, try to get some volunteers. We have several agencies who loan us their employees for the pit count. They get to count that as their work time, and they come out Wednesday night and Thursday and count with us. So that's an option for getting volunteers. And as Jessica said, leveraging your faith community as well. We have several churches here that are incredibly involved. The Unitarians have a social justice committee. A lot of churches have social justice committees now, and they send a contingent of people. You're also going to want to ask your non-traditional partnerships what they know about their homeless contingent and the people that they serve. For example, we do partner with ECHIA Region 3, and every year before the pit count, I sit down with Sonia Pitsy, and we compare notes. We compare her list with my list, and we look for hot spots, we look for trends, we look for people who are not on my list but might be on hers, and vice versa. And we can add that to our list as well. We also work with Marikey, which is our local mental health provider. They have several people who they know where they bed down at night, as well as places like hospital social workers, etc. Anybody who might have someone that touches the population we serve. And we were able to get volunteers. We had one lady from the hospital that came and volunteered on her off time because, you know, that's a thing that she felt passionately about. So don't discount agencies that are not necessarily working with homeless populations, as we are starting to move from a siloed perspective into a collective impact model. And I think that that is the way that people are going nationally. We're starting to see homelessness and the pit count more as a cross-sector community activity and not just a social services and specifically homelessness agency activity. All of that being said, once you have a list, what I did was every zone gets its own list, and that's what you're seeing on the right. And it's listed the name of the place and the address so that your search teams can put it into their GPS easily, and they have a specific set of places to check. And they are also given instructions that they are not just to put their blinders on and only check those locations. They are to be looking as they go from place to place, as they make their way from one spot to the next. They are to be on the lookout. And if they check any other places, we usually keep blank fields below so that we can add them to the list, so that the searchers are actually helping crowdsource improvements to the pit count every year as well. Could you advance my slide, Brendan? Thank you. All right, so our county is large, and as you can see, we had a lot of zones. Once you break it down into all of these little sections, you have to staff those sections. We had so many volunteers last year, and you need that, and you need organization. So what we did was we sort of did, and this is going to sound really pyramid schemey, but I promise it's not. We did a pyramid style hierarchy that helped keep our count organized. Every volunteer was put onto a search team, and they get assigned to a specific list of places, a specific zone. For example, Carlisle has 5 search areas. Those 5 search areas are overseen by what's called a zone overseer, who then reports to the Unsheltered Count Coordinator. So the night of the count, the Unsheltered Count Coordinator is in direct communication with these zone overseers, who are actually physically in the area where people are counting. For example, we had a group out in Camp Hill last year, which is at the northern end of our county. Instead of making them report to our Unsheltered Count Coordinator for the county, who was back in Carlisle and couldn't get to them easily in an emergency because they were almost 30 minutes away, we had a Camp Hill zone overseer who oversaw all 6 count teams for Camp Hill. And she was positioned or stationed at the Giant in their little coffee shop. And she was the person that the count teams checked in with. Every half hour we had them check in with the zone overseer, who then called into the Unsheltered Count Coordinator to get updates, just so that there was more of a sectional or a zone-based leadership style, so that not one person was so overwhelmed with things. We talked about community volunteers making the count happen, cooperation from agencies, leveraging the faith community. I want to talk for a minute about social media. Social media is your friend. A lot of people I know are sort of hesitant about putting things out there, but down here we've had pretty great success with advertising our pit count. There's got to be a better word, but advertising our pit count, for lack of a better word, on things like Facebook. We put out a press release, yes, but we also used our LHOT Facebook page, which is a public-facing Facebook page, to both recruit volunteers and let people know what we were doing. Because most people experiencing homelessness they do have access to the internet, and most of them are using social media. And people are more likely to let you interview them if they know why they're being approached. And we had lots of people actually say, oh, I saw that this was happening on Facebook, and they were more comfortable letting people talk to them. Organization is the key to running a good pit count. I can't stress it enough. If the pit is going to work the way it needs to work, and the count is going to be as accurate as possible, it has to be systematically done, it has to be organized, and it has to be well staffed. So organization is going to be the key. And I firmly believe that one solid source of information, aka the Unsheltered Count Coordinator, delineating the information to zone overseers who then filter it down to the count teams, makes for clean lines of communication, and it prevented any duplication. We had no duplication in our county last year because only one search team searched any given area. You had your little block that you were searching, and you stayed in that block. So we were incredibly lucky that well, I'm not even going to use the word lucky. We were incredibly organized, so we didn't have any of that overlap. We didn't have any of the duplication that can sometimes happen. And frankly, it made getting all of our stuff into DMA on time a lot easier, because we were able to just go again systematically, folder by folder, get everything into the system, and we knew exactly what was happening and when. Can you advance my slide, Brendan? Pretty please. Jessica talked a little bit earlier about pit count safety, and I want to sort of piggyback on that. Best practices: don't go out alone. I know that we all have people who are incredibly competent and incredibly self-assured and have really good reputations with the population we serve, but safety says pair up. We always send people out 2 by 2, and I like to tell people, when you're interviewing, you might have one person actually walk up to the person to do the interview, and the other person hang back just in case something happens. So there's a little bit of distance there. The next thing we require our people to do is check in. Every half an hour, each search team is required to call into their zone leader and let them know where they are, that they're safe, and if they found anyone. And then that zone leader calls back to the Unsheltered Count Coordinator just to check in, see if there are any updates, etc., so that we're always in communication with each other every half an hour, because it is late at night and we can't control the environment around us. The third thing is let sleeping people sleep. And Jessica talked about this as well, about using the observational forms for when people are asleep. The worst thing you can do is wake up a person who's already feeling unsafe because they're sleeping somewhere that is not sheltered. So if you see somebody bedded down in a car, use your judgment. If you think they're awake or you can't see in, I would knock on the hood of the car. Don't knock on the window. Knock on the hood or the trunk, and let them decide if they're going to approach you or let you approach them. And if they're asleep, let them be. We encountered several encampments last year here in Cumberland County, some that we knew about, some that we did not know about. We encountered several new encampments. use your senses and listen to your gut. Only you know your community. Don't be a hero. If you find an encampment and your gut's saying maybe not, mark it down, let your coordinator know, and maybe go back during the day to see if you can talk to them then. There was an encampment last year that we knew about that has been historically difficult to interview, but we had two guys, one of whom had experienced homelessness and had lived in the camp at one point, and he said, if we go in with pizza, they're going to let us interview everybody. So that search team went to Little Caesars and bought 7 pizzas, trooped into that camp, and got 20 interviews that night. So use your best judgment. Again, you know your community. Listen to your gut. Brendan, do I have any other slides?
That was the last one.
All right. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I think we can probably open it up to any questions that folks have about anything we share. Thanks so much, Chris, for that. That was super helpful. We'll take questions in the chat box for a couple minutes if folks have any questions about anything we discussed during the webinar, about any of the slides.
And I'll just put it out there that if any county coordinators for Unsheltered want to discuss with me further or have questions later on or need help breaking down their county, I'm going to put my email in the chat box. Please feel free to email me or call me, and I'd be more than happy to chat with you about it. I'm kind of a point-in-time count nerd.
I did see a comment from Amy in the Western PACOC that their county teams are split by their school districts, 2 teams of 2 in each area, which has worked well for them. Thanks for that, Amy. It's very different for each community, depending on the size of your community and the breakdown. So I think it's helpful to hear, how you worked it out, Chris, in kind of a larger county, and also, Amy, how you did it in your county. So thank you for that.
School districts are a great way to break it down.
All right, well, I'm not seeing any questions. I'm not seeing any dots of people typing. But if folks have questions, they can certainly reach out. Brendan posted this slide with the next steps, so we'll be posting the webinar. Please continue or begin your county level planning meetings. We've posted a lot of materials on the pit count page, which the link is here if you need it. And feel free to reach out if you have questions. You can reach out to pahomelesscount@dma-housing.com. If you have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to ask. We're more than happy to troubleshoot any questions or concerns that come up. And if you're a county unsheltered coordinator, we distributed a lot of materials to you all. But if you are new to it and you need more support, or you kind of want to talk through where should you go next, please feel free to reach out, and we're more than happy to talk to you about that. So thank you all for participating. Thank you, Brendan and Chris, for all the great information. And you all will be getting more information from us about next steps as we go. But if you ever feel like you're unclear about what the next step is, always feel free to shoot us an email, and we're glad to let you know.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Chris, Lee, and Jessica. Have a good one.
All right.